So this is a nice quick video. We're sitting here in Joseph Lindsley's favourite watering hole and office space. And it is truly fantastic. This is a feature of Ukraine: the food, the drink, the ambience, the focus on living comfortable, nice life, but also fighting for that right to do it is something that seems to characterise Ukraine. Joe, you've been here for quite a long time now, and you've seen it at some of the darkest periods of recent Ukrainian history. What keeps you here? Because of course there's a fight in the US. There's a fight for democracy there as well. What keeps you?
They have. I'll move this over here. Yeah, Jonathan. Well, I mean, first it was a very simple and basic thing that kept me here. Now we're almost into 3 years of the full-scale invasion, and from February 24th, 2022, the first day of the full-scale invasion, until right before Christmas this past year, I spoke every single day on Chicago's WGN radio, every day at 3:20 p.m. Ukraine time, 7:20 in the morning Chicago, live, 10 minutes from Ukraine. And every day, there was no holidays except for weekends, and we were the only foreign media that did that. There was a lot of daily reporting in early 2022, but we kept it going, amazingly for almost 3 years, and that was as long as that audience in Chicago was there to listen to me, and in the Midwestern United States was there to listen to me every single day. I was never going to take a day off, and strangely, perhaps not surprisingly, that show was canceled just a few weeks before Christmas by the corporate executives, and I think we sort of existed under the radar of corporate media for a while. They almost didn't know what we were doing every day, but it became hugely popular in Chicago, and it was a way for people to feel that they were here in the war. And as I look, back on my experience in different media in Washington and New York, I think the biggest problem in American media, and this extends to American politics, is that we don't solve problems. We ride like the wave of the cycle, and then we jump to the next thing. And what I always have wanted to do, and why I had problems in my career in New York and Washington, I said, let's keep reporting on this doggedly until there's a solution, until there's resolution. And so I was very grateful for those 3 years we had this chance. It's something I had to fight for every day to keep the stories interesting and to keep the audience hooked. And only did I realize in the vacuum after losing that show, and by the way, the station was flooded with messages from listeners. It was the most popular segment they had.
So that doesn't make sense then, because surely if it's popular, you get advertising, or advertisers uncomfortable in that kind of segment on war. Is it a corporate decision, a commercial decision, or is it actually political, or is it just simply come down to lack of comprehension about the format and what you're talking about?
I think with the advertisers, I think it was all right. I mean, they knew it was popular, and we started to have hard cutoffs at the end of my segment because they had advertisers that wanted to be there, it was popular among different constituencies in Chicago, left and right, and there was nothing like it. And after a while, it became a morning ritual for so many people. By the way, you can see all these reports on at JP Lindsley on YouTube and Spotify and our channel UkrainianFreedomNews.com. But so it was very popular. I suspect somehow there might have been some Russian money influence somewhere. We start every once in a while we get Russian sort of hate mail written by pro-Russian people, which is very different from like negative comments from genuine people. You can see the difference. But the story I was told by the producers was that one day one of the executives of this company, which is quite a major media company in the U.S. that owns the station, had never listened to this, and he woke up one morning in December and happened to turn on the radio, and he said, "What the hell? We're still going to the this Ukraine show every week?" And he calls the station, and the producer's like, and he says, "What? We're going to Ukraine every week still? Come on, it's 2024." And the producer said, "Actually, sir, it's every day." and the guy was furious, and I won't swear like I was told that he swore, but he said, "Get it off the radio." And the staff, the host of the show, Bob Surratt, a great guy, he didn't want to lose it. It was his vision that let us do it, and they tried to keep it alive, but the executives wanted to kill it. And notably, they wanted to kill it in a way that made me look bad and them look good. They wanted to say that we were going to come up with a new plan for 2025. We're going to phase out before Christmas. But as soon as I saw the writing on the wall, I was planning to go on for another week. And I'm on the air on a Monday before Christmas, and I realized that, no, I have to make it clear to the audience what's happening. I'm not going to let the corporate media disguise their cowardice and their lack of imagination or whatever it might be. And I just said to the audience, I hope you find a good way to stay in touch, to understand what's happening in Ukraine. You are well informed because you've been with me every single day these 3 years. And the station was flooded with sad and angry messages. But I think so much of that is simply, and this, again, extends to our politics, it's a lack of imagination, saying, oh, this is not how things are done. Everyone else gave up on this every day, in 2022. Why are we the outlier? And, here we are on the cusp of, we've survived this long here in Ukraine and on the cusp of a lot of big changes with what's happening in Washington. And I think it's the most extraordinary time. And as I've said, Jonathan, as you know from your stories and reporting, Americans love self-help books. Ukraine is the world's best self-help book. And that's why I was just in Kyiv, you can't be depressed there because, there's so many problems and there's missiles and drones coming down upon you and people find ways to live. And so at the very, very least, whenever you think about this ideologically, it's not boring.
It seems to me there's a fight for the soul of, dare I say it, it's going to sound quite pompous, but Western civilization. It's that fight between people who are looking at the problems they've got, examining those problems, being evidence-led, this is a big part of it, rather than ideological, but actually being solution-oriented and having a concept of how responsibility is an important part of whatever solution they deliver. It cannot just come from top down. It has to be a mixture, I guess, between government and people taking on part of the burden of solving those problems. That's what we see in Ukraine. And it's a fight against what you could broadly describe as the Soviet mentality. But it could cover all things. When the state is providing 100% rather than part of the solution, it's about a top-down solution or lack of solution, or pretending you're delivering a solution and then delivering nothing. Because again, we put labels of left, right, and center, but we see this kind of behavior irrespective of who's in office and their partisan beliefs. But it seems there's a fight for the very soul of the West. The trouble is, if you're solution-oriented, you're looking out for opportunities. But if you get down this hole where you feel victimized, that prevents you actually being open to opportunities. And this is where people fall into these traps of partisan politics screaming at each other.
Well, I think, as we think about solution-oriented government, you could say, but I think in the West we have almost a Soviet-light mentality. And there's let's look for clean solutions that we can sort of package and say, this project is finished, but ignore the deeply human things like people's desire to be free. And I think, Ukrainians, and I think even Zelenskyy himself, has been a thorn in the side of the West, of Western elites and Western leaders, because, it was cool and inspiring in 2022, but they're like, okay, come on, man, move on, right? Do you really have to be that free? And that Ukrainians are like, yes, we really want to be that free. And right now, I think there is this desire to be like this in America, and we see this throughout Europe, but Ukrainians, I think, understand Western civilization better than the rest of the West. They're actually preserving these values. As you see when you're here, you see, the churches are crowded, free speech is free. You don't have these sort of deep, there's a sense of identity here and a confidence in it that is people are searching for or maybe have lost in the West. And I think, I even think of this, one of the big topics of controversy now is President Trump's funding of, pausing of USAID funding. You know what? Frankly, I kind of supported that because the USAID type of funding is a Band-Aid. When we look at only looking at the situation here in Ukraine, you can fund all these different programs, on and on and on. For example, let's take a one that most people can agree on, like funding veterans hubs, programs for veterans. But if you don't ever send the weapons and the permission to use them, if you don't actually have a plan for victory, you're going to have to fund more and more and more veteran subs and more cemeteries and more PTSD programs because you don't actually get to the source of the problem. Mm-hmm. And I think here's the opportunity for Ukraine now. The deep frustration in America that they got Trump elected is that people are sick of this. They're sick of it with the American border. Republicans and Democrats for decades. We're going to solve it. And then nothing happens. and they're demanding that. And if they don't start to see good results, they're going to be not very happy. And so, this is why the USAID funding, in a sense, the pausing of it's good, because we have to realize, take off the Band-Aids, get to the source of the problem.
I'm going to come back on that one because I spoke to a Ukrainian this morning, and he said, let's qualify this a little bit. The idea of having transparency in funding is actually good. It's something he can support. He's an NGO which is losing part of his funding. And he said, if you do it in a structured process and you have a strategic outcome at the end, because you can't do a review of funding unless you know what the result is. And one of the problems we discussed with the Biden administration, they had no strategy apart from Ukraine to survive and Russia not to collapse. Well, these are mutually incompatible goals. It's guaranteed failure. But if you're going to review all the funding of all the NGOs, you have to measure not just are they doing quality work, 'cause that's meaningless. You have to measure it against their impact and their purpose, which means you have to have a strategic objective. So I think there's a couple of problems with this. One is, will the Trump administration have a strategic objective and a criteria to measure the resumption of funding? The other challenge, of course, is that this is going to have, there are ways to do it. You can do it without stopping funding cold. You can do it as part of an active process where you're putting the structure in place to review the criteria, and you have some kind of, you give people a heads up so they can plan, they can make alternative plans. That's one of the problems, that it's just come out of the blue. He admits they should have done more before, but when you get funding from somewhere and it's really hard to crowdsource, you're going to go with the easier thing. The other challenge, he was saying, is that actually the pause in funding is a little more pernicious than perhaps most people realize. It's not that okay, you're not going to get this money that you expected. If you have signed a contract to get US aid and it's anything from, part of to all of your funding, the contract says you have to cease your work immediately, even if US aid is a minority part of your funding. So actually the way it's being done is potentially extremely damaging.
Well, I've seen this with the way USAID funding happens. There's always strings attached. So for example, with the independent media in Ukraine, which does exist despite what the propagandists say, there's independent media, but they're not quite independent because so often their funding comes from EU and USAID. And when it does, they can never criticize the U.S., and that's a problem. And it limits free speech.
Same in Georgia, actually. We'll come on to Georgia in a minute, but Georgia is an interesting problem.
And USAID actually puts so many strings attached, but is it attached for the American interest or for some narrow bureaucratic interest? And I tell you, look, we can say, wishes for fishers. We can say all the nice things, this should be or that, but the fact is, American people, they need to see reasons for this. And you look at the suffering in California, and the hurricane, that's why one of President Trump's first stops was in North Carolina, my home state, where the hurricane happened. American people vote as they wish. They say, here are what our problems are, who's listening to us and who's not. Why? They don't owe, they've already given so much, actually, to Ukraine and to the world. And they're saying now is the time to fix this and to make sure that we address our problems here at home. If you don't respect that, you're never going to appeal to them at all.
No, but the driver is understandable.
Yeah.
The outcome is probably not what's intended.
For the people here, but for the outcome for Americans is all right.
It's not. No, let me argue this. If you take Georgia, you have a lot of NGOs probably, doing, reasonable work and whatever, and that needs to be measured. But almost all NGOs that are fighting Georgian Dream are dependent on EU and US money. They're in a fight for their lives against Georgia Dream. So I absolutely get why there's this impulse to take the funding, but you have to look at the practical implications. The implication in Georgia, now Ukraine's not going to fall as a result of this. It's going to make a lot of things hard for people for a time. In Georgia, this could mean the difference between Russia winning and losing. And surely Russia winning in Georgia, creating a tyranny that you get out of Orwell, is not in the US strategic interest, but that could be one of the outcomes.
Well, so this is why we have to fundamentally understand, what are most Americans thinking about themselves, about the world, and because we can say all we want, this is bad if Russia wins, but the Americans aren't going to listen to that, and I understand why. And as we've so often discussed, there's three main stumbling blocks to a lot of Americans even wanting to care about Ukraine. And I know this even from a small story of Ukrainian soldier musicians. Some of them wounded, like lost limbs in the war, and they were traveling the U.S. and performing at concerts and all that, and just making connections. And 3 of them went into a bar in California, and they weren't, before they even spoke, they had some Ukrainian gear on, and there were some old guys in the bar, and they said, "Get out of here." They didn't even want to see the Ukraine flag. They were so mad. And one of the musicians, Kolya, goes up and he says, "Oh, I'm actually Ukrainian. Like, can we sit down and have a beer? Can you tell me why you hate us so much?" And in the conversation, it became clear that these Americans didn't hate Ukraine. They hated Washington, and Ukraine has become the scapegoat. And in some way,
political football, in the way it hasn't become in the UK, which is kind of interesting process. Yeah.
Well, I think, and this is, Biden sort of allowed it by sending announcing new funds for Ukraine during the hurricane. The optics were terrible.
He made everything worse at every step, through whether it's in net.
Almost, I wonder if it was you have to wonder if there's some intentionality to it, because it was consistently.
I just don't think it was high up on his priority list, so he just didn't give it the attention it needed.
Well, this is what we saw from both Biden and Harris. You have to listen to the American people, and if Ukrainians want support, you have to listen to the American people. And the main thing, and when I say this to Ukrainians, they can't believe this almost, but there are 3 things that prevent Americans from wanting to care. Wanting even to listen to a conversation about Ukraine. You could say anything, but because of these 3 things, they don't even want to listen. So first we have to address it. 1, after 20 years of Iraq and Afghanistan, so many Americans bought the story of George W. Bush. USA, USA. I have friends who signed up to fight, who then realized, wait, what was this for? Americans have a trauma from having believed that, and then seeing that it actually was not what it was meant to be. And now whenever they hear Washington from any side talk about war, they don't want to listen. So whenever someone like my old mentor, Bill Kristol, or someone gives good arguments for Ukraine, they're like, we're not listening to you anymore. And I respect that, because you should be skeptical after those voices lied to you.
Kind of cry wolf.
But yeah, and in a very disastrous way. So we have to really realize that. And we have to show that, Ukraine is totally different. I reject what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. I quit my jobs for that. And Ukraine is actually more democratic than most European countries, lower crime, more tradition, more family values. It's everything Americans want, but they just don't see it because of these blinders. And then quickly, the other 2 are, very simple things, it seems, but these stick in the American imagination. The fact that this Victoria Nuland, that one woman created or was the orchestrator on behalf of the United States of Ukraine's revolution in 2014. Americans are ripe to believe that, including people like RFK. Look, he comes from trauma. RFK, his father and uncle were assassinated. Of course he's going to be traumatized. And this is the deep violence of America.
And wouldn't the CIA love to be that powerful? Wouldn't they love to be able to topple governments that way?
This is why Victoria Nuland, she never comes out, since 2022, she's never done this. If she really cared about Ukraine, she would make very public statements saying that she was saying the truth. If you look at that phone call and actually listen to it, that was leaked in 2014, she was trying to stop the revolution. She was trying to get the protesters to make a deal with the pro-Putin regime. And if she cared, she would say it. But you know what? This is the problem with the bureaucrats. And this is why Americans are happy to have a freeze of bureaucracy, because the bureaucrats love to be the main character. Oh, I'm creating the revolution.
The guy who died, I've always forgotten his name. The guy who's 100, Kissinger.
I used to go to baseball games with him.
No way. Well, you got Kissinger. You've got that idea that there's a balance of superpowers. That has sort of traveled through all the way down to, our nemesis, who I'll never forgive for his just ignorance and arrogance, which is Jake Sullivan. Incompetence, ignorance, and arrogance in equal proportion. Yeah. But they bought into the same vision that the Soviet Union and then Russia was necessary to this mystical balance of powers, and you have to do everything possible to prevent Russia from collapsing, and then they'd imagine all sorts of, scenarios, which actually, when you speak to experts, it's incredibly low probability of nuclear war and so on. So you can see that through Nuland and others. They didn't necessarily want to annihilate Ukraine, but it was far more important for them to maintain some kind of mystical stability based on their theory of geopolitics. Yeah. And I think that cuts through the last 3 years as well. We've got to break out of that. The only way out of Russian imperialism is for Russia to literally fall apart. fall apart and disintegrate.
Well, if you think about, how often if we were and search on Google or ChatGPT, how often the four Western leaders, Biden, Macron, etc., when they talk of Ukraine, how often do they use the word sovereignty and how often do they use the word freedom? Seldom do they say freedom, because they themselves are afraid of freedom. Macron doesn't want a yellow vest revolution and the yellow jackets. These politicians, they fundamentally are a little bit afraid of Ukraine's Maidan revolution, as are politicians in Kyiv, because it is truly
as are Washington, terrified of it.
Terrified. Is the most is Russia. Russia is so afraid of the Maidan, that's why they have to send ballistic missiles. Tear gas was not enough. Bullets were not enough, and now they have to send ballistic missiles to try to stop this epicenter of freedom. And so, it's hard for Americans to see it because we believed that Iraq was freedom. And no, this is actually the model of it. And when I read, one of my favorite books on American history is Tocqueville's Democracy in America. What I see here in Ukraine is like that to a super degree, because we had slavery back then. Ukraine is more free than America was. And so we have, and then the third point I have to mention is this: it's one company that sticks in the American mind, Burisma. They think that Biden helped Ukraine, even though he really stopped Ukraine from winning, because his son made money from a company called Burisma, which actually is Russian and not Ukrainian. And if Americans could see these three things, that Victoria Nuland was trying to stop the revolution, that Burisma was actually also trying to stop the revolution, and that the war machine that pushed us into Iraq and Afghanistan is not interested in a quick Ukrainian victory.
And both Obama and Bush took away Ukraine's weapons and tried to demilitarize them and turn them into the vulnerable territory that almost fell. Yeah. And again, it's not a party thing. It's this common process of fearing freedom, but also sort of misunderstanding the emergence of this incredible nation state and identity, and the instability or the fear of instability that will create.
Do you think they just, because it was easier to,
it's easy,
it was more
it's
comfortable
bureaucratically
to have?
easier. Yeah, absolutely. It's the same with the nuclear thing. They fear Russia collapsing, but they also fear the bureaucratic headache of having to deal with 30 countries, persuade each one to get rid of their nukes and whatever. It's a form of bureaucratic laziness and lack of imagination.
When I went back and listened to George H.W. Bush's Chicken Kyiv speech, partially written by Condoleezza Rice, who later would get us into a lot of trouble as well. Very nice lady, but and in that speech, he's so venomous and he's so condescending to the Ukrainian parliament, people that were so sick of Soviet chains, and he's saying, to want to break free from Moscow is suicidal nationalism. It's jingoistic, and just. Almost desperately trying to keep these people enslaved, and then we see, as you said, it was a bipartisan effort. Look at every time Ukraine pushed for more freedom. So, 1991, they ignored HW's advice. They went for freedom and independence. So then Clinton comes along. He later apologized for it. Leads the Budapest, which, by the way, Budapest is not only about nukes; it was about de-arming Ukraine.
Yes, de-arming, defanging.
In general, yeah.
Their bombers were taken away. Mm-hmm. Their military was destroyed, and it's almost like, this is almost like a collusion between the US and Moscow. Yeah. Because then you have Yanukovych, a puppet Moscow government. Even Poroshenko, to an extent, is like this. They hollowed out Ukraine's military from the inside out. And the US, I think US and Europeans were absolutely fine with that. Hence the Minsk Accords. Again, stability, says quote, at any price.
Keep your freedom in check. Calm your freedom down.
Yeah. Calm your freedom down. Carry on being nicely corrupt, so we don't have to worry about that part of the world.
So we can make some money from the deal.
We can make money, and we don't have to, really do the hard thinking about a more complex, fragmented world. Well, that world's come now. So,
well, there's an irony, and the Russian propaganda knows as well, and they push it because, the West has tried to take advantage of Ukraine, but the taking advantage of Ukraine is not helping Ukraine win. It's quite the opposite. So there's truth to it. Yes, of course they've taken advantage, but they've actually abused the freedom of this country. And one storyline that gets missed in 2004 was Ukraine's peaceful Orange Revolution. Keep trying to get away from the orbit of Moscow. And that was successful for a time. And what happened a few months later? A bipartisan effort from Washington. Senator Barack Obama, Democrat, Senator Richard Lugar, Republican, came to Ukraine. They went to Donetsk, and they oversaw the continued dismantling. So you could pinpoint, every time Ukraine breaks for freedom, there's more and more strictures put on the country, and in a bipartisan way. And I do think it's well worth asking questions about this and analyzing it. And I think now we see this moment with the question for Trump and his team: do you want to actually just continue this American foreign policy that actually is responsive to the tyrants of the world and not imaginative and not really pro-freedom, and actually is limiting America, or do you want to break through this and have some confidence? And I think this is really the moment that we have, and that's why, I mean, going back even to the USAID stuff, I say we can talk about funding all we want, and that's what Americans are sick of. What they want to see is what's effective, what's going to get results. And if right now Ukraine is still in this strong position, having held, Ukraine is so strong that Russia has had to turn to North Korea to get stronger. Now, as that happens, Russia's going to get stronger, and they are. But right now, America could have, as its best friend in the world, the most battle-experienced army in the free world, the most innovative army in the world, as your ally, going forward in this new era.
Protecting one of its largest markets, which is Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the other message which, if Europe falls, what happens to the American economy? I mean, this is one that really needs to be hammered home. It's in a bad place, a very bad place. And a lot of jobs will get lost as a result. If Europe stands, if Ukraine stands, then, I mean, this last year has been the best year for American weapons exports. Right. It's a huge, huge job generator. So a free Europe is hugely profitable for the US.
Well, one reason why it's profitable for American arms exports is precisely because America won't let Ukraine win, because the defense industry knows it's profitable to keep Ukraine alive long enough for Europe to get scared to start buying weapons. And so I would say to all those who think that the defense industry supports Ukraine, the defense industry supports Ukraine not winning too quickly.
They're terrified. They're terrified about the technological evolution
it puts
that's
them to
happening
shame.
Here.
Because, like a $5,000 drone, the U.S. defense industry will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on it.
Exactly.
And Ukrainians are more effective.
And it won't be effective. I mean, this is a guy, I mean, we'll have to sort of end here and continue this one. But I think there's lots of vested interests. There's bureaucratic sort of sloth and lack of imagination. We lack leadership in all of our countries. The EU, I think, is terrified of Ukrainian freedom because it'll really shake things up when they join the EU. Mm-hmm. It will happen, but it's going to be a revolution in thinking. They won't put up with the slow, bureaucratic, consensus-led pace of the EU. But all of our military procurement systems are defunct, I would say now, because Ukraine, the company I met in Lviv, every month they have another iteration of their drones. So within 3 months, you're 3 generations in, each one getting better and cheaper, not more expensive, cheaper each time with more capability. And this is quite an interesting story, if you place a contract, let's say in the US or British defense industry, well, you might place, you place the order, you get all the paperwork done, that could take a couple of months. Eventually, after 3 to 6 months, you place the order. It might take another 6 months to deliver it. Well, Ukraine's already 12 generations in, and you're getting defunct technology at 10 times the cost of what Ukraine's doing. Of course, they're terrified.
Yeah, and you're not going to be ready for China or anything. And we look at, for example, Anduril, which is seen as one of the most innovative defense companies in the U.S. They're building a huge plant, I think, in Ohio that can produce, I forget, something like 10,000 drones a year. Like, they're lethargic, they're behind the times, and actually those from the defense industry who come to Ukraine, they almost don't even want to know the reality here because they know it's going to create a lot of work for them. They're going to have to be innovative. And so we say to the American people, if you really want to shake up the Defense Department, this is the key. And the last thing, Jonathan, Elon has been tweeting recently about make Europe great again. You say if Europe falls, Europe has an identity crisis within itself. And there's a lot of struggles within Europe. Ukraine in Europe and in the Council of Europe is pretty unique. Poland is similar in some ways, but Ukraine is like to Americans I say it's like the Texas of Europe. But even there's deep culture and ritual and tradition here. There's this really big devotion to freedom that you don't see in the rest of Europe, and this is being erased not only by Russian missiles but also by Western inaction. But it's so hard to get Americans to see this, I think. But everything that they're pining for in America, and they're saying, oh, we need, Europe is losing its values. Ukraine still has that, as you see here.
Has the solution.
Yes, both on the innovation side and the military side, but also on the cultural side.
Definitely. Well, we'll continue these conversations. I think we agree on far, far, far more. And when we don't agree, we have a robust debate about it, which is what I think people need to get used to again. Not this sort of partisan, bickering, weaponized social media nonsense. We've got to bring our own personal evidence, our own personal beliefs, and have proper dialogue, civilized dialogue about these things.
That's the free speech we see in Ukraine. And I think it's in those tension points. Actually, that's where we learn so much, and we can figure out, okay, these are the things we have to really think about and analyze. So,
what do we have in common? What's our common goal? And here you see it all around. Good life, good food, strong culture, freedom. These are things I think everyone should be able to get behind, if only they knew they existed. Well, let's carry on doing this because it's helping to get that message out and reach people right across the political spectrum in different countries. So, Joe, thanks for what you do.
Jonathan, thank you for being here in Ukraine, it's your voice is an opportunity for Ukrainians to be heard and for the story to be told. So thank you for your courage in coming here on the ground.